So Roger, thank you so much for joining me. Where are you today? What time zone are you on?
I am happily sitting in the nation's capital here in Washington, D.C., and it's a bright and warm 9:34 a.m.
Wonderful, wonderful. And what are all those wonderful, I mean, obviously on the podcast people can't see, but you've got some wonderful pictures behind you and certificates. What are all these great things?
Okay, so over my right shoulder, that's the first Obama inauguration. So it kind of goes chronologically. I was in charge of the cabinet, so I had 22 military escort teams under me, and that position allowed me to get into virtually everything. So those two documents right there are the program from the prayer service at St. John's Chapel right by the White House. And then the rest are my credentials that allow me onto the platform and things like that. So I was actually backstage with President-elect Obama right before he walked out onto the platform to take his oath of office. This right here is the second inauguration where I was more in charge of a problem-solving jump team. So I opened up like metro stations that were closed that were supposed to be open and things like that. And then this right here is the script from when he did his surprise appearance on Saturday Night Live in December of 2007. And so as we were leaving that night, I was in charge of his appearance on the show, and it was all very secret. I looked over and I saw the script in the wastebasket, and I said, I should probably grab that. And then my wife gave me the best advice of all, which was spend a little bit of money having some of these things professionally framed. So that's what you're looking at over my shoulders.
Okay, well, I'm embarrassed to say what's behind me. Let's not talk about it. But Roger, tell me, how did you come to work on the Obama campaigns? How did you first become the director of special events for the first campaign?
Sure. I grew up working for John Kerry. I answered an ad for an internship in 1989 and then never really left his office. I kept interning and volunteering for his election campaigns and things like that. And then soon enough, by the time I got out of grad school in the mid-90s, I joined his staff. And then within a few years, he was starting to travel the country, laying down the basic building blocks of running for president. So, which really started in 1998. So the Kerry campaign was 6 years long for me. And then in the course of that, just like any other kind of intense exercise that people go through, maybe a startup or something like that, you become very close with a handful of people. That ended in defeat, as we all know, but then it ended in Senator Obama becoming the U.S. Senator from Illinois. Some of my best friends from the Kerry world went to work for him, and then fast forward 2 years later, when he decides he's going to run for president, I got a call in December of 2006 asking me if I would help on his campaign announcement, and I did that in January of 2007, and then I was asked to come on board full-time, and I traveled 30 states with him in the first campaign as director of special events.
Fantastic, fantastic. And what lessons do you think you could share with us from that campaign that we could apply to business? Are there, I mean, that's a huge question, but maybe there might be one or two things that you might share?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm in the business of helping people amplify their authenticity and their honesty. And what we were able to do was build a culture around a very unique individual. And that culture included everything from our online tools to our communication strategy, to our door-to-door marketing strategy, what would loosely be called grassroots marketing. And what we did from the very beginning was we followed his credo, which was to say, we're not going to change who we are. We're going to go out and we're going to look people in the eye, and we're going to be absolutely honest about exactly who the candidate is, what he wants to do in the course of the campaign in terms of engaging millions of people, and then what his vision is for the country over the next 5 or 10 years. And if people embrace it, then we'll move forward and we'll get closer to possibly winning. And if they reject it, then we pack up and we go home. And what I mean by that is he laid it out from the very beginning. We're not going to shape shift to accommodate a particular trend or a particular news cycle or anything else. We're not all of a sudden going to wake up one morning and say, we're going to be tough on crime or we're going to crack down on immigration because it seems to be popular in the polling right then. Absolutely authentic from the beginning to the middle to the end, and then building a culture around that individual that matched that same authenticity. That's the largest takeaway, and we'll probably get into that in a couple different ways during our time together this morning.
I think that's really powerful. I love that. I love that not to shapeshift. I love the fact, to amplify authenticity and honesty. I think that's great. I wrote that down because I thought that was so good. So you've said that the Obama campaign working on it over the 18 months was like actually working 10 years in a corporation, that the amount that you achieved and covered. You must have been going at some pace. How did you maintain that pace and keep everybody with you? Stress
and poor diet are key. No, it's having the stamina really comes from optimism, my belief in the American experiment, and my belief in him as an individual. When I make those comparisons to organizations or corporations, what I mean by that is this kind of, we would land in a city, say, with 5 days until the candidate's going to be there, without any venue, without any crowd, without anything. And we would build something of the complexity that would be similar to a major university's commencement. We would do it in 5 days with all the social media components, the earned media components, the paid media, the advertising, the reaching out to 15, 20, 25,000 people, all in 4 or 5 days. And then when you aggregate that out over a year and a half, we actually mounted a $1 billion corporation that is born in January of 2007, learns how to walk in the first quarter of 2007. And then before you know it is galloping. We raised $110 million in 11 months. And then the whole thing is over the following November. So the whole life cycle of it is really 19 or 20 months of a $1 billion corporation. Campaigns are private corporations in the United States, believe it or not. And then so when I go out and I work on corporate projects and things like that, one of the things that the leadership is always very interested in is, how do you bring that same sense of urgency where we would get that amount of work done in 4 or 5 days, and then layer it on to a university or a corporation that would have multiple teams working on something like that for 6 or 9 or 12 months, when we would get it done in 4 or 5 days. So that kind of level of urgency, that kind of adrenaline, is what corporations are really interested in. Fantastic. Really, really fantastic, really powerful. And what do you think about traditional media? So obviously you use social media. Is traditional media, radio, TV, is it newspapers, is it still alive? Is it dead? Does it have a place? You know, it's funny. I think the obituary of newspapers has appeared in newspapers themselves many, many times. But the fact of the matter is, we're seeing a renaissance in journalism in this country right now because of, you know, how vigorous the news cycles are. The most effective communication strategy is not one that constantly lunges at the app that you heard about from your 14-year-old kid's friends. It's important to be aware of new developments and new ways to reach out to people, but the best communications or marketing strategy really looks at multiple touch points in a consumer's life, and how do you weave your value into those touch points. And one of the ways we did it was looking at earned media, is what we would call it. So all those events, as director of special events, it's what I went around and did, was events. And we would look at the coverage that we would get the next day in that local newspaper. That local newspaper that's been landing on that person's doorstep for the 30 or 40 years that they've spent on this planet. And so it was more looking at, how is this person already living their life? How are they already getting their information? And then layering our content into those mediums while still being aware of the emergence of social media and things like that, but looking at it as a full spectrum, so that when you're driving, you would hear something on the radio. Sometimes you would pass even a billboard to go really old school. And then you would open your phone or sit down at your desktop, and we would have a presence there. So literally from tools that date all the way back, you know, 5 and 6 centuries on through applications that were just invented in the most recent couple months, making sure we have a consistent, authentic presence in all of those is the best way to mount a comprehensive communications and marketing strategy. So I still read newspapers, I still listen to the radio, still watch some TV when I have time. So I get it. So tell me, is there a downside and an upside to having to deal with all of these different media? Could you repeat that, because you froze up just a little bit? I freeze? I'm so sorry. That's okay. What are the upsides and the downsides to all the media? Well, it's interesting because we have to remember that when we talk about old media, even things like television and radio and newspapers are very fluid concepts right now. Television, for example, we're essentially in the day and age where you and I could witness the same accident in a traffic situation. But then when we go home, based on the networks that we watch and even the specific programming coming at us through those networks, you could get a news stories of the accident that you and I witnessed that would portray it in very different ways. Maybe one from the driver's perspective, one from the other driver's perspective, one from the law enforcement perspective, etc. So these tools are old and they've been around for a while, but they're changing very rapidly. Some of the overall challenges are that radio and TV and newspapers are still kind of a shotgun approach to communications and marketing, which is you just kind of get your content into and onto that vehicle, and then it sprays out into the world, and you just hope that somewhere in all the touch points out there where that information lands is your target demographic and that you're going to get through to them. And that's still healthy and it's still valuable, but it's vague and it's very scattershot. The digital media component of it is much more of a needle rather than a shotgun. You can actually target very specific 25 to 35-year-olds who subscribe to the New York Times or whatever, and are homeowners, for example. So you have a needle in one sense, you have a shotgun in another, but you need both because they both are portals into where people are living their lives, how they're making decisions, and how they're getting information.
Okay, fantastic. So your current organization is New Day Strategy. What are you offering clients at New Day? What are the services?
It's a lot of what we've been discussing here. What I do is I go in and I try to learn about what the organization really wants to do and whether or not they really want to change. That's kind of the most interesting thing for me, is since I get approached by a lot of organizations and everyone says they want to change because that's what their board wants to hear, or that's what their shareholders want to hear. But when you peel away a couple layers, it doesn't take me long, for example, to find out whether or not an organization really wants to change. And humans are kind of opposed to change in a lot of ways, and especially organizations of humans are opposed to change because we're pattern seeking, etc. And so the most interesting thing for me is to sift through that organization and see if they really want to change. Once I determine that they do, then the path forward is relatively easy. And what I try to work with them on is taking the same sense of urgency, taking that accelerated time frame in terms of marketing and reaching out to individuals and layering it onto their organization. It's funny because when I finish meetings with some of these folks early on, especially in higher education, they'll say it's May, and they'll say, okay, well, what is your July like? And I'll say, my July? I'm going to have a draft to you by close of business tomorrow. Like, the world I operate in is, you either get it done in 72 hours or it doesn't really matter. And that's one of the things that I think people are interested in having me bring to their organizations, is kind of a vitamin B12 shot of adrenaline and a sense of urgency to get people back into kind of a startup mentality.
And what are the best kinds of clients for you? Is there an industry or a type, or are you quite wide?
What I do is I've made myself a promise, and it's an easy one to keep, which is I'm never going to put lipstick on a pig. And by that I mean, if someone's dumping toxins into a river and they want someone to mount a communications campaign that says they're not dumping toxins into a river, New Day Strategy is not their firm. For someone out there who is doing the right thing, and I've been working with MIT, for example, for 5 years, and they're having a tremendous impact all over the world in terms of their innovations when it comes to water and healthcare and sustainability and energy. So when someone like that, who's already doing the right thing, who's already having a positive impact on humanity, comes to me and says, we would like your help helping our culture become a little bit more assertive, a little bit more confident about telling our story, then I can sign up for that. I worked with the city of Dublin in their bid to host the 2023 Rugby Cup, for example, which was a perfect example of an uplifting project that could engage grade schools and community youth centers and all kinds of things around the central organizing principle of hosting a sporting event that would also help the local economy. So that to me is a no-brainer. So as long as folks are in it for the right reasons and they're trying to do the right thing, I will move heaven and earth to help them. if they want to have someone come in and say that 2 + 2 is 5, I'm not their guy.
I mean, that's really lovely and clear. I love that phrase, lipstick on a pig. But I also understand not only is it great to work with Dublin for rugby, but also Dublin, what a great place to be. It's a shame you do things so quickly. You could have had a longer stay there. So
I know. I got to go 3 or 4 times, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, and I always knew there was a strong nexus between Dublin and Boston, but I got to the point where I actually was bumping into Bostonians scrolling down the street in Dublin, which made it additionally fun.
Fantastic, fantastic. So you've been speaking for a while, about 10 years, I think, professionally. And what are the unexpected insights and lessons you've learned as you've been working as a speaker?
Wow, that's a great one. And it relates to my prior point. And a lot of the speakers out there will probably maybe sympathize with parts of this. You get invited to a lot of coffees and dinners and cocktails and things like that, where usually the CEO or some level of the leadership wants to get together before, or mainly after, like a presentation to their marketing team or something. And it's very interesting for me at first, because they go on a little bit of a journey on this, as do I. At first, the CEO is interested in, the communication strategy or the online tools. But then as we spend about a half hour together, what they're really interested in is the culture. How did you end up with a staff of 3,500 people, all of whom are willing to get up and work from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week for 2 years around this campaign? And so that's how I ended up getting into kind of the corporate cultural change component. It wasn't for me just waking up in a vacuum one day and saying I should go off and pursue these kind of corporate buzzword kind of corporate culture change ideas. It was more from listening and learning to these CEOs all over the world, CEOs of banks in the Middle East, CEOs of insurance companies in Asia, really interesting group of people. And then looking at my experience and what I had been through, listening to them in all of my in the 25 countries that I've been fortunate to visit in, and then taking from them this appetite to really rejuvenate their culture and bring kind of a startup mentality to an established brand, which is how, for example, I ended up doing a really fun 2-year project with Ernst & Young, which is very similar to the MIT work that I've done. So that's been the most interesting thing, is finding out that the leadership of a lot of the clients around the world are really ultimately interested in the culture of these campaigns and how some of those lessons and tools can be applied to the culture that they're in charge of.
That's fantastic. And I also understand, because you told me earlier, so that's how we know, that you've been on a bit of a tour delivering masterclasses across Asia. What have you been doing in that area?
So a lot of what organizations go through, and I hear this both from middle employees to entry-level employees, all the way up to leadership, especially if the brand has been around for a couple decades, is they have added so many layers of process and steps that just on an institutional level, without necessarily intending to, they've ended up being kind of an idea-killing machine. They have built up a culture that really stifles creativity and makes it very difficult for the culture to become nimble, agile, react quickly, have creative ideas that they can implement in short order. So what I've done in the last year or so is put together a series of exercises that actually take elements of my MIT work and the Ernst & Young project that I did and build that into a workshop where I work with the leadership of an organization, but also the communications and the marketing staff, to see if we can open up some of those log jams and see if we can remove some of those steps of process, to see if we can open up that organization so that it's able to cultivate and encourage a true spirit of a startup, kind of a small business tech startup, and try to shrug off some of those decades of process that get built up that ultimately end up making it very difficult for new ideas to happen. So those workshops have been tremendously effective. And a couple times, like one I can think of that I finished in Asia just a few weeks ago, we all kind of looked at each other and had kind of the hair on our necks kind of standing up, because we really felt like something powerful had just happened. And I've followed up with them since. and they're actually implementing some of the ideas that we workshopped in just those few hours together. So it's really exciting, and it has results, which is additionally gratifying.
And that's what clients want. That's brilliant. That's absolutely perfect. That's what businesses need. So that's brilliant. So finally, I want to ask you, Roger, having been on the circuit a while, having had experience working across different industries, if you were talking to yourself 10 years ago and giving yourself advice starting out as a speaker, what advice would you give yourself now that you know so much more?
Well, it's funny, this may be a little bit different than what you're asking for, but my very first trip was to Kuala Lumpur, where my first speaking engagement ever was 1 day long. So we put it together, so it was like a multiple series of workshops with some other people speaking too as well, but I ended up having to do like 3 90-minute sessions or something like that. And I just carpet bombed these poor people with every single bit of political insight and communications insight that I had. So that's more of a joking answer. I think what I would have done would be to create a mechanism for collecting some of this feedback very early. It's only been in the last 5 years or so that I've really tried to focus much more on listening than speaking. And I think some of that also was my nerves starting out. For those of you who are just kind of starting out in this, you know, when you're sitting in that green room and there's 10 minutes to go, and then 6 minutes to go, and then 3 minutes to go, that can be like a long series of a couple minutes, because it's pretty nerve-wracking. Because people are taking their time out away from their families and their other responsibilities to listen to you for an hour or two. So I would have probably been more aware of listening from the beginning, but it has been an amazing journey, and I'm glad that I managed to open my ears when I did, let alone just all the years opening my mouth, because I feel like I've learned more running around the world these couple dozen times than I have imparted to some of the clients and things like that. It's a big, beautiful world, and there's amazing people out there doing amazing things. And I've learned a couple things that I think can help a bunch of folks that are trying to do the right thing, that just need some help, you know, maybe with their culture or some of their leadership and telling their story a little bit better and a little bit clearer. But I think in the aggregate, I've run around this world and I've learned more than I've taught.
That's a wonderful place to leave it. Roger, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.